our series in Judges. Judges is a book that is filled with awesome stories that we all know. Even the kids will know these. This is a family service, so the older kids are with us today. They're normally with our children's pastor, Rachel, in the back. But we want to do this where we emphasize the importance of kids as a part of our church and as a part of our community and their growth, and also just to help them know what we do, because kids are curious. Sometimes they think that we're doing something really exciting out here and they're missing out. So they'll get to see that it's a little bit different than they might expect. So hopefully it's not bad. But I won't sing and dance and make anything into a song. I don't know if Rachel does, but if I do, you can all leave expediently after I start singing, because that's what would happen. So don't worry. Last week was an interesting first part of Judges chapter 8. We talked about killing the spider. That title was kind of misleading in some ways, because there's no spider mentioned in the first part of chapter 8. We can address that now. But killing the spider is really talking about what we need to do in our lives. Is we need to address the problems. Instead of going after the symptoms, the cobwebs, and we always like to knock down the cobwebs. There's a Hispanic revivalist in Mexico, and he actually talks about the story. A woman come on with during a revival. A woman came up to him and said, I need you to pray that God takes the cobwebs out of my life, knock down the cobwebs in my life. The next day she came up, and he said this was a very devout Christian woman. And he said next day she came up and said the same thing. And the third day she came up and said, I need God to knock the cobwebs out of my life. And he said, no, what we need to pray is that God kills the spider. Because if you kill the spider, the cobwebs go away. If you address the problem, the symptoms go away. So I think a lot of times we spend our time addressing symptoms instead of chasing the actual problems. A lot of times we do that, one, and maybe because we might be blind to what the problem is. The other part is, it's usually easier to just knock down some cobwebs and kill the spider. Right? I mean, who's the spider killers in their family? Kristen is not. Guys, I think it's usually guys. We got a couple ladies that do too. We got some spider killers. The problem is, it's easy to find the cobwebs, right? They're left behind even when the spider's gone. The spider may not be in the place where the cobweb is. You got that fantasy where you're walking through like a ninja through the cobwebs, trying to knock them down after they get all over you. It's really great if you're bald. Ron knows what I'm talking about, because you can feel it all over the top of your head. So knocking the cobwebs down is easy because they're a lot easier to find than the spider. This week, we're talking about the golden temptation. We heard about Gideon last week, how they chased their enemies and they defeated the Midianites. They took them over, they defeated them. For the Bible says they chopped their heads off. It doesn't go into gory detail, but it's very truthful of what happens to the Midianites. So they have defeated them, and scripturally, it's around 150 to 200,000 warriors that they defeated across a long distance. So that's what we saw last week. So this week we're coming back. They're coming back to their camp. They're coming back to their towns. And they want to try to make Gideon king. We'll see that in the first part. They're like, Gideon, be our king. Be our leader. You led us. Which seems to be a regular theme through Judges, where they're trying to make someone king other than God. God's country, Israel, was supposed to be his country. He was supposed to be the king over them. That's why they didn't have a king in place. And it seemed like they led into problems a lot in that one. They led into problems with themselves. They led into problems again and again. Pastor Rachel and Daniel and I kind of joked that Judges is a story about receiving victory and then going back to jail over and over and over again, because they get out and then they go back, and they get out and they go back, and they get out and they go back, and they just repeat the cycle. And I think a lot of times we look at that and we're thinking, I would never do that. I can't believe they do that. They're so ridiculous. But I think if we were all honest and we really reflected into our own lives, I know for myself, I repeat things a lot. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. So we have to be willing to look back at that. And we have to be willing to turn back from those things. And again, that's addressing the main issue. So I think we go through the issues of hot and cold. We go through seasons where something's really warm, something's cold. Like I love music. And I go through seasons where I love music more than I do other times. And I love this show and I love it, and then I get tired of this show. I get tired of doing this or get tired of doing that. I get tired of the Chiefs football after they lose to the Raiders on a Thursday night game. We all have these things where it's just like, I do not want to watch football. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to go to church. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to do this. I don't want to hear about it. I'm sure at the end of basketball season, most of the time, you're kind of like, I don't want to touch a basketball for a few weeks at least. You're like, I'm sick of it. I'm tired. I don't want to look at it. Engineering class, let's be honest, as much fun as it is, you probably get tired of it too. So even things we enjoy, we find ourselves cycling through those. So let's look through and we can see this, how Gideon and them address this issue. And of course, theirs is in a different circumstance than ours. In our society, it's about upgrading your cell phone every 2 years or sooner. Everyone, they have plans that you can get it every year. It's about getting that new car every year, every 2 years. It's about getting the new clothes. It's about getting new jewelry or whatever it is. We cycle through things, and it's part of our society. So their society is different than ours because they don't have cell phones and cars and all of those things. But this is where they are led to. So we'll pick up in Judges 8, verse 22. It will be on the screen. If you want to follow along in your Bible, you can as well. Verse 22 says, Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, Rule over us, both you and your son, also your son's son, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. Yet Gideon said to them, I would request of you that each of you give me an earring from his spoil. For they had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. They said, We will surely give them. So they spread out a garment, and every one of them threw an earring there from his spoil. The weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold. If you're like me and you don't know what a shekel is, this is 43 pounds of gold. It's 42 and a half, if you want to be exact. But it's about 43 pounds of gold is how much 1,700 shekels is. A shekel is a use of monetary form, but it's also a use of weight. So this was about 43 pounds of gold. Besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple robes which were on the kings of Midian, and besides the neck bands that were on their camel's neck. Gideon made it into an ephod and placed it in his city, Ophrah, and all Israel played the harlot with it there, so that it became a snare to Gideon and his household. So Midian was subdued before the sons of Israel, and they did not lift up their heads anymore. And the land was undisturbed for 40 years in the days of Gideon. So they made an ephod. Just to get some understanding, an ephod is used as two different terms in the Bible. I know this is like the educational side, but it makes the point. One form of the ephod, which is used a lot through the Old Testament, is a garment, a sleeveless garment that the priest would wear. I don't think as a pastor people like me wearing sleeveless stuff, so I'm guessing it went over a robe, is how they wore it. That was one term. The term that is used here and later in Judges, it is believed that an ephod is an idol. It is a statue, the way that it was made. Just in case you're curious of what that is. Now, if you remember back to when we first started Gideon, or if you're familiar with the story, or if you're not, I'll explain it. Gideon's family was the keeper of the altar of Baal. That was the foreign god that they were worshiping, the false god that they were worshiping. And God told him to destroy the altar. His father was the keeper of that altar. His father was the keeper of it and the Asherah pole. So that was where they did sacrifices. That's where they worshiped. That's where they did all of those things. So he comes back to his city after they've gotten victory. They've beaten the Midianites. They were delivered from the Midianites because the Midianites were attacking them, stealing their food, stealing their goods. He was making his grain. He was threshing grain in a wine press when we first started reading about Gideon a few weeks ago. So he was trying to hide what he was doing because they just needed food. They were hungry. They were starving. So when he comes back, he makes an idol. After God delivers him, he makes an idol to put back in the town in probably about the same place where that original altar was. Gideon did not know what to do without what his family's legacy was. So that was what they did, was the keeper of this. It's kind of like there's a lot of pastors nowadays who their family line is a line of pastors. It's kind of the same essence there. But the ephod, he made it. And I think the point of it is that I really think the point here is that Satan tempts us with what he knows to be most tempting to us. For them, they were used to worshiping another god. They were used to worshiping a false god, and they were used to going here and going there. They wanted something visible to worship, something visible to follow. And that's what he was doing. He was building something so they could have something to look at. Because how hard is it to worship something you can't see? You know, how hard, like it's air. You can't see oxygen, but you know you need it. How do you worship something you cannot see? How do you follow something you do not know? And that's where they were. It was a golden temptation because they took 43 pounds plus the other things and made that into a golden ephod. It was something to get their attention. It was something for them to become the caretakers of, and it became a snare for him and his family. Him and his family then became the keepers of the ephod. It says they have 40 years apiece, but after that, if you go on further, it says that they were again basically overtaken. And they went back to sinning, and they were overtaken again after the 40 years apiece, and they had troubles again. And then we'll see that start over next week again when there's someone else come and sent by God to rescue them. But I think we look kind of at the story kind of haughty. We look at it and we think, this would never happen to me. Christians especially, we tend to think that sometimes the Bible story doesn't apply to us. Because it's like, well, I've never built a statue of gold. Well, I'd be honest, I don't even own anything gold personally. My wife does, but I don't have anything gold, even my ring. It's not gold, it's cobalt. I don't own gold. I wouldn't make a statue, but I think we put other things in place of God. The first thing that I think a lot of people put in place of God, especially, again, we're talking about in the Christian circles, in the Christian churches as a whole, not in this specific church. But the first thing that people put before God is their building. How many multi-million-dollar buildings do you know that people have built, and they've built it to be this extravagant-looking thing, and they spent money and money and money to make it look as extravagant as humanly possible? And then when you come to church, it's about going into that building, and that building has then become special, and that building is certain because of this or certain because of that. We meet in a community center, so we know that we do not think that a building is somehow superior to another building. But in our minds, if we're all honest, we would think, well, if we were in our own church building, it might be holier, or it might be godly, or it might be better, it might be more filled with the Spirit if we're in a certain place, in a certain time. In Islam, they have to pray in a certain direction. They have to face towards the temple. You face east towards the temple to where it's built. They have to pray that way. And I think, and I've talked to some Muslims, and they'll tell you that if they aren't careful, it becomes a ritual, it becomes a pattern, something they have to continually do, and they do it just because of that. I'm doing it because it's something I've always been taught to do. It's just like kids coming, when they become adults and they go to church as adults, it's because they've gone to church the whole time as they were kids, and they just keep coming. It's like, I don't know why I'm here. It's just an hour, it's just 2 hours out of my week. It's just something I've always done, so I keep doing it. So if we're not careful, we put the building and rituals before God. The other things I think that we put before God are pastors. Not talking about necessarily any specific pastors, but if you watch TV, if you watch people talk about, some pastors are the voice of God. And I'm not saying they're not, but their voice is worth more than any other pastor's voice. Or they're this. Billy Graham was that for his generation. He was the voice of God. He was the mouthpiece of God. His son Franklin is still used as a voice for God. But if you take a pastor's word over the Bible, if you take his word over what's being said in the Bible, it's becoming too far. And I haven't seen that with either of them, but there are some pastors who might. So we have to be careful of that. But what temptations are there for you? What temptations are there that you're chasing? What temptations are there that you're following, that you're looking for, that you let distract you? We're in a lake community, let's be honest. Summertime? Sunday morning I could go to the lake. It's just right there, just right down the road. We live a mile or mile and a half from Taneycoma. just go down the lake. We'll go down there. Or, it's not that important. Maybe we'll do something else. But it's easy for us to put other things there. We have to know where we stand and what gets us there. So some temptations are different, though. Maybe you're a sports fan, so during football season, you're going to be up in wherever at the stadium watching games. If you're a Kansas City Chiefs fan, maybe you're in Kansas City every weekend when the game's there. Maybe if you're an NBA fan, we're talking about some serious money if you want to go to every NBA game or every baseball game, because there's a ton of them. But maybe you're at every one of those. Maybe you're watching every one of those. You won't miss it for anything. Temptations are different for us. And the thing that we have to know is that we are not going to be the first, and we are not going to be the last people to be tempted. In Scripture, we see that Jesus himself was tempted. He fasted for 40 days. First of all, that's crazy. I have many friends, including myself, who think 24-hour fast is just unattainable. Let's be honest. That's a long time without food. 24 hours, no food, no water, even if you want to go the full biblical context. 40 days, though. Jesus fasted for 40 days, and it says that Satan came to him. It said, I'll give you the world. Throw yourself off. Angels will protect you. It says, do not tempt God. Jesus himself, about went southern there, Jesus himself was tempted. So how come we wouldn't be tempted? How come we're not going to be tempted by things that are around us? And that's the important part. Satan tempts you with what is most tempting. For pastors, for church leaders and stuff, your ministry can become your God. And by that I mean you get so focused on this is what we need to do, this is how we need to do it, this is the ins and the outs, and we don't spend enough time focusing on God. If we can be focused on that instead of what God is doing. And if you've never known God, if you've never met God, temptation is all around. How do you know what temptation is? Temptation is that thing that you shouldn't do, but you probably still will. It's kind of like my dad used to tell me when I was a kid, if you have to ask if something is wrong, it probably is. Right? You ever have that with your dad? Hey, do you think I should be doing this? And it's kind of like, well, if you got to ask, you probably shouldn't. Because sometimes it's in our own mind, we want to justify doing it. So we're going to be like, well, I think it could be okay. So we have to. But I think everyone has some sort of idol that can get in their life. People pleasing can easily become an idol. Anybody a people pleaser? I want to see a hand or two. Anybody a people pleaser? I know I am. I am to an extent. I know I am. We're the kind of people that you'll never say anything mean to somebody because you're afraid that you'll hurt their feelings. Or, well, maybe I can kind of nudge them in another way and they won't do it. People pleasers are real. People pleasers are alive. The other side that we get into on the people pleasers are the people that are just brutally blunt. And I don't know if I really have anyone here brutally blunt that I've met, that you've told me anything super blunt that hurts my feelings, because I don't really wear them out here on my sleeves too much. But you have those people, and I think both sides of it, we say, well, God made me this way, and we allow that to be our crutch. We allow that it's our temptation just to make people happy. It's our temptation just to tell someone like it is. And let's all be honest, even the people pleasers get that feeling where they want to say, just shut up and listen. This is what you're doing, and you get that urge, and it becomes that temptation too. So sometimes you have to find that balance, and for me, I have to find that balance between the two. But what do you do? And these are things that happen in the secular world. It's not like it's just in church, it's just church world. It happens for kids at school. I'm going to do things this way. When I was a kid, when I was in grade school, the reason I wanted to get good grades wasn't to get good grades. It was to make my parents see that I got good grades, or make the teachers see I got good grades. It was to impress the people around me. It wasn't because I cared about how good my grades were. As long as I stayed on the honor roll, it didn't matter. Because then everyone else would be like, oh, well, he's doing good, or he's doing this, and we seek that out. And that can become a temptation too, seeking out compliments. You guys know the compliment fishing? Hey, yeah, I got this done. Husbands and wives are terrible at this. Be like, like me and Kristen, and I give her a hard time sometimes, but like when we drive, me and Kristen are very different heights. My wife, she's 5'5", I'm 6'1". So we get in the car. I sent her a picture a little bit ago. It's from the movie The Incredibles, the big guy, he's in like the car like this. I said, this is how I feel when she drives the car and I get in. It's like the seat is not right. So what you do when you're in a marriage relationship like that and you want to fish for a compliment is you set the seat back for them, right? I mean, especially new cars, they have a button. So all you have to do is push the button. Like, it's not like you went out of your way. You're like, boop, okay, and then you hear the seat move. Or forward for me. I got to do it after I get out or it's going to suffocate me. I feel like you're in the movie Christine. It's a very dated reference. Some of you might get it. But you might catch yourself fishing for compliments, and that's a temptation in itself. Because we all want to feel like we're wanted, we're needed, we're doing something valuable. So we have to watch ourselves on those different temptations, because these are the easy ones. I'm not even talking about the hard ones, like, talking about lusting after the people around you, lying to people, committing adultery, all these hard things. If you hate somebody, it's the same as committing murder. I wasn't stupid. Like Thursday night watching the football game, I'm thinking, man, I got to really try hard not to hate these refs right now. Because it was just like, it's never going to end. And we all have that in different scenarios where it's like traffic. Y'all know me talk about my driving. I hate it. Driving and then people can't drive, especially in the rain. I bet you guys faced this morning. People are driving like 25 and a 45 because it's misting, and you're like, just go. Just, if you can't drive, get off the road. Who's here heard these things this morning on the way to church? I'm proud of myself, actually. I didn't say any of those this morning. I'm surprised. Normally, I don't have to travel very far to say one of those, but those are temptations. Road rage, I don't have road rage, I have road frustrations. That's what I always say, and it's the same thing. It's just an excuse to say that I don't have road rage, but that's a temptation for me. So what the point of all this is that temptations are all around us. It's not just these big temptations that we look at and say, well, I'm not tempted to break any of the big commandments. I'm not tempted to do this, but if you allow your emotions to control you more than you control yourself, that itself is a temptation. If you allow your mind to go places you don't want it to go, that is allowing yourself to fulfill a temptation. The temptations are all around and in any way, and what that means is that it's not that it's the end of the world, it's all doom and gloom, but what it is that it takes accountability from ourselves. We can pray, we can ask God to guide us, and we can do it, but the thing is, if you constantly pray the same prayer, but you never do anything different, you're not trying, if you're waiting for God, that's one thing, but if you're just not moving when God tells you to move. It's kind of like the story, right? The guy, hurricane, flood, he's on the roof of his house. A boat comes by and says, hey, get in, we're trying to rescue you. Guy says, no, God's going to rescue me. The boat leaves. Helicopter comes, the water's getting higher, it's almost to the roof. Helicopter comes and says, get in. He said, no, God's going to rescue me. The guy dies, because, floods, he dies. He's in heaven and says, God, why didn't you rescue me? He said, I sent a boat and a helicopter, what else did you want? Sometimes we have to take what is given. Sometimes that means moving in a different way than we see. Sometimes that means moving in a different light than what we would expect. So I want you to think for a moment. What is the temptation that's getting you? I'm not even standing on the camera. What is the temptation that is getting you? What is it? We all have at least one. If you can think of a list, don't write it down. You might discourage yourself by that list, and then discouragement becomes your temptation. But think of just one thing this week that you want to work on. If your temptation is getting angry and driving, then God, let's work on that. And that's me. That's right here. My solution is I'm not going to drive this week. No, because then, if you ask Kristen, I'm just as bad, if not worse, at riding than I am driving. So that's not going to fix it. So find that temptation. Because we all have a temptation. We all have a sacred idol in our life. Maybe it's the type of music that you like. Maybe it's the way that things happen. It's the church building. It's the things that can consume us that aren't necessarily bad things in themselves, but when they become the only thing we think about is when they're wrong. And that's how Satan tempts us. That's how he works. Because he'll tempt you with what is most tempting to you. What is most acceptable to you is the temptation that he's going to use. Because he is working to deceive us. He is working to come against us and to separate us from God. That is his goal, is to pull us apart, to separate that relationship. So allow yourself to pray and to earnestly look for what is coming against you, what is coming between you and God, what is that temptation that he is using. As Karen comes to play piano, as we come to close here shortly, I want you to think that, do you put God first or an image of God first? Is it God himself, or do you have an image, an imagination, a vision of what you expect him to be, and that is what you do? As a kid that grew up in church, I grew up in a Free Will Baptist church my uncle was a pastor of, and then his dad was the pastor before that. The temptation there, the vision of God that I was shown, that I was seeing, was a God that was vengeful. A God that if you didn't line up to the expectations, you didn't meet the standards, a God that was going to punish you. Right? A lot of us saw that version of God. And we see that God, when you mess up, he's the one scowling down at you, looking at you thinking you've messed up, you screwed up, you're lost, you're not saved, you're this, you're that, and all of these things come to our minds. But what is your image of God? Is your image of God that, or is it a loving Father? Because if you look through Scripture, even Judges, which is a story of failure after failure after failure, after God rescues them, God still comes back. If there's nothing else you learn from Judges, God still comes back. God rescues them after they have failed. He comes back and he rescues them again when they're lost. He comes back and rescues them when they worshipped other gods. So if that is not what a loving parent does, then I don't know what is. I know if, like my dad, if I needed anything, he would help. And that's what I think of a good father. It's not the kind that just punishes you and punishes you and punishes you because you make mistakes. But it's a father that loves and cares and corrects. Correction is part of it. But it's the way he corrects. God doesn't correct us in a way that is punishment. He corrects us in a way that he wants us to grow and move forward, not one that's saying, I'm going to end your life now because you messed up again. This is over. I'm going to leave. You're no longer my child. You're no longer my son. You're no longer my daughter. That is not the image of God. So if you're tired, if you're weary, ask God to come. I'm going to ask you guys to stand with us as Karen prays and Karen plays. I'll allow you guys to pray. Say that 5 times fast. We don't have our altars quite yet. They're getting close. If you need time to pray, you need a moment to pray, we invite you to pray at the front row. If you don't have a relationship with Christ, or your relationship with Christ is not in the right place, if you feel you don't know this loving, forgiving Father, we invite you to come up and we invite you to pray. One of us will pray with you. If you're just going through a hard time in your life right now, we invite you to come and pray, because we believe there's nothing greater you can do to bring your problems before God, to bring your issues before God and allow him to work